The year is 1177 BC. The air in the city of Ugarit smells of salt from the sea and dust from the fields. A scribe presses a stylus into a wet clay tablet. It's a letter, a desperate one, from the king of a neighboring land. The words are a plea. Behold, the enemy's ships came here. My cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country. This wasn't just happening to him. All across the eastern Mediterranean, the world was on fire. In the grand palace of the Hittite king Suppiluliuma the Second, another letter is written. Not a report of enemy ships. It's a desperate request for grain. His people are starving. For 3,000 years, these were the last panic voices from a world on the brink of vanishing. An entire network of civilizations, Mycenaeans, Minoans, Hittites, Cypriots, that had traded, fought, and flourished for centuries, all went dark in the span of a single lifetime. They left behind only burned cities, abandoned palaces, and one final, terrifying question. How could all of them fall all at once? This wasn't the fall of a single empire. It was a system collapse. A globalized world, more interconnected than anything that would exist for the next 1,000 years, simply ceased to be. Imagine a world connected by shipping lanes stretching from Greece to Egypt, from modern-day Turkey to the coast of Syria. A world where a single shipwreck like the famous Ugarit off the coast of Turkey could hold cargo from 7 different cultures, 10 tons of copper from Cyprus, 1 ton of tin from as far away as Afghanistan, Canaanite jars filled with resin, Egyptian ebony, amber from the Baltic. This was the late Bronze Age, a world of magnificent empires ruled by kings who called each other brother. They were rivals, yes, but they were also partners in a complex, fragile network of trade and diplomacy. And then, in the blink of an eye, it was over. The great Hittite capital of Hattusa, a fortress city of massive stone walls, was burned and abandoned forever. In Greece, the palaces of the Mycenaean warlords, the heroes of Homer's Iliad, were destroyed. In Cyprus, cities were leveled. Ugarit, the city of scribes, was so violently destroyed that the final, desperate plea for help was found still baking in the kiln of the oven where it was being fired when the city fell. An entire world erased, and in its place a dark age. Literacy vanished, populations plummeted, art and architecture became crude and simple. The intricate network of trade was gone. For generations, people lived in the shadow of the ruins of a world their great-grandparents had built, a world they could no longer comprehend. What happened? For over a century, the answer seemed simple. It was written in stone on the walls of the Medinet Habu temple in Egypt. There, the pharaoh Ramesses III carved monumental reliefs of his great battle against a mysterious confederation of invaders he called the Sea Peoples. He depicted them with feathered headdresses, their families in tow on ox carts, fighting with a desperation that suggested they were not just raiding, but migrating. They were a people on the move, a tidal wave of destruction crashing against the shores of civilization. For a long time, this was the accepted story. The Sea Peoples were the villains. They were the singular cause, but it was too simple. It didn't explain everything. It couldn't explain the evidence of a deep, widespread drought that scientists like Israel Finkelstein later found in ancient pollen samples, showing the fields of the Near East had turned to dust. It couldn't explain the evidence of massive earthquakes that leveled city after city, discovered by geologists like Amos Nur. And it couldn't explain the internal rebellions, the signs of civil war and social breakdown that archaeologists found within the cities themselves. The Sea Peoples were not the cause of the collapse. They were a symptom of it. They were just one more desperate group in a world already falling apart, where famine and climate change had turned neighbor against neighbor. The mystery deepened. If it wasn't just one thing, but a perfect storm of many things, was there a trigger, a stressor we were missing? The clues were not in the grand inscriptions or the burned palaces. They were hidden somewhere no one had thought to look, in the bones of the dead. The discovery that changed everything. The answer, when it came, did not arrive from a dusty dig site in Syria or Greece. It arrived in a sterile, state-of-the-art laboratory at the Max Planck Institute in Germany, in the hands of researchers like Johannes Krause and Philipp Stockhammer. They weren't archaeologists in the traditional sense. They were pioneers in a revolutionary new field, paleogenetics. They were retrieving ancient DNA, or aDNA, from human remains thousands of years old, and their work was about to find a killer that left no visible trace. The technique is painstaking. They take a tiny sample, often from the dense part of the skull behind the ear or from the pulp inside a tooth, which acts like a tiny time capsule, protecting fragile DNA for millennia. In the lab, they use powerful sequencing machines to read the billions of genetic letters preserved in that dust. At first, their goal was to reconstruct the human story, who lived where, who migrated where. But then they started finding something else. They found the DNA of things that were not human, bacterial DNA, viral DNA, the genetic ghosts of the diseases that had afflicted these ancient people. In 2018, a study revealed the DNA of Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that causes bubonic plague, in the teeth of a 5,000-year-old skeleton. It pushed the history of the plague back by thousands of years. It was a stunning proof of concept. The invisible killers of the past could now be found. And in 2022, a team led by archaeogeneticist Gunnar Newman turned their attention to the Bronze Age, specifically to a 4,000-year-old burial site in a cave on the island of Crete, a place called Hagios Charalambos. And inside the teeth of two individuals from that cave, they found it. Not just any pathogen. It was Yersinia pestis, the plague. In the heart of the Bronze Age world, right before the collapse began to accelerate. This wasn't just another theory. This was a biological smoking gun. The discovery on Crete changed the entire equation. Suddenly, the perfect storm had a new, terrifying ingredient. First, consider the physical evidence. The world of the late Bronze Age was crowded. Cities were densely populated. Trade was constant. The very ships that carried copper and tin, like the Uluburun vessel, also carried people, animals, and grain stores. They were perfect vectors for disease. A single infected sailor or a single rat on a grain ship could introduce a pathogen from Egypt to Greece in a matter of weeks. Second, the chronological evidence. The plague DNA found on Crete dates to the period just as the system was becoming more stressed. Now, look at the evidence for drought. Climate data shows that right around 1200 BC, the rains failed. For decades. This leads to crop failure and famine. What happens when people and animals are malnourished? Their immune systems are compromised. They become exponentially more vulnerable to infectious disease. A plague that might have been a localized outbreak in a time of plenty becomes a civilization-ending pandemic in a time of famine. Third, the behavioral evidence. What do people do when their crops fail and disease is spreading? They move. They flee their homes. They become refugees. Suddenly, the image of the sea peoples with their families in ox carts isn't a picture of barbarian invaders. It's a picture of desperate families leaving their plague-ridden, famine-stricken homelands, looking for somewhere, anywhere to survive. They weren't attacking civilization. They were the ghosts of a civilization that had already died behind them. And finally, the genetic evidence itself. The new DNA analysis doesn't just identify the plague. It shows us how interconnected these people were. Studies from teams led by researchers like Philipp Stockhammer show that even in small Bronze Age villages, there was constant movement. People married from outside, travelers passed through. The interconnectedness that made their world so prosperous was also its single greatest vulnerability. The plague wasn't the single cause of the collapse, but it may have been the trigger, the final push that sent a system already stressed by climate change, famine, and political instability over the edge. For a century, we told a story about a strong world destroyed by violent outsiders. The story on Ramesses' walls. It's a simple, satisfying story. It has clear heroes and villains. The story the DNA tells is more complex and far more terrifying. It's a story about a complex, fragile world that died from within. It's a story about an invisible enemy that turned the systems of connection and prosperity into highways for contagion. The fall of the Bronze Age becomes a cautionary tale. It's a story about what happens when multiple crises, environmental, political, and biological, all hit at once. The collapse wasn't a singular event. It was a cascade failure. The drought weakened the population. The plague exploited that weakness. The resulting chaos and migration shattered trade routes and toppled governments. The Sea Peoples weren't the first domino. They were the last domino to fall in a long, catastrophic chain reaction. What remains unknown is the true scale. We've found plague DNA in Bronze Age Crete and a few other sites. Was it everywhere? Was this a pandemic on the scale of the Black Death in the 14th century AD? The evidence is still being assembled, tooth by tooth, from the silent ruins of this fallen world. We look back at the Medinet Habu Temple, at the carved reliefs of Ramesses fighting the Sea Peoples, and we see it differently now. We see a king trying to make sense of a world unraveling for reasons he cannot comprehend. He can fight men in boats. He cannot fight a drought. He cannot fight a microbe, so he tells the story he can understand. The story of a great war against a human enemy. The Bronze Age collapse teaches us that civilizations don't always die with a bang. Sometimes they die of a fever. Sometimes the most powerful force in history is not an army, but a microscopic organism. It shows us that interconnectedness is a double-edged sword. It creates prosperity, but it also creates systemic risk. The end of this world wasn't a grand battle. It was likely a series of quiet, desperate tragedies. A farmer watching his crops wither. A family watching a loved one sicken with a fever that has no name. A king in his palace writing desperate letters for grain, unaware that the true enemy is already inside his gates, silent and invisible. It's a story that feels, in our own fragile and interconnected world, disturbingly modern. And it is a warning, written in